Hello everyone. I first want to start with some sad news, so we got that out of the way. Last year I was here as well, and I was showing my shirt. And I was very proud of this shirt. I wore it to every conference, and the reason for this was that I bought it at React Europe, my first React Europe. It was also my first conference, so I was so proud at being a conference that I felt so professional that I had to buy a shirt. I even wore it with holes in it and still gave talks with it. Now, the sad news is that I lost my shirt. It's really sad. I have a shirt which looks very familiar, so no one will notice. Look at this. Thank you. Yeah, so I see it as my version 2. I'm now in my version 2 stage. So, introduction. My name is Ives van Hoorne. I haven't seen a language in which my name is easy, so you can also call me Ives, Ives. For some reason, my friends have more trouble with my name than others, so they call me Flip. If you want to call me Flip, fine as well. I'm the co-founder of Code Sandbox, and my Twitter handle is CompuIves. I also have a very cool personal website, but it's written in Angular 1. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say it. And look, this part is of Angular 1. This is Angular 1 doing its work, the counter. Oh well, let's get started. So last year, I was here as well, giving a talk about Code Sandbox. It was called A Year of Code Sandbox. Who was here last year? Wow, React Europe has good retention. After I gave a talk about how Code Sandbox, the idea started, and how it started from being a side project that I worked on in my free time and during lectures to a project that was used by a lot of people at the same time. This year I wanted to give a similar talk, but then what happened in the last year since the conference talk, and it will be a bit more technical. The problem was the name A Year of Code Sandbox was already taken by me last year at React Europe, so I had to think of a new talk name. So now I call it Another Year of Code Sandbox, Tech Edition. I'm very bad at naming things. I don't know why I am programming at all. Before I get started, I want to give a small recap, because I love telling this story and I find a good excuse to do it. So 3 years ago, I was on vacation to St. Ives, and I was at the time working full-time for a company called Katawiki, and we were converting our Ruby on Rails pages from Ruby on Rails version 2 to React. And we were doing this with a team of 4. And I was on vacation, and I got a question from my coworkers about React specifically, in combination, I think, with either Redux or React Router. And I didn't have any way to answer them because they sent the message on Slack. I had to parse the message. I had to use my own compiler in my head. It was very cumbersome. So that's when kind of the idea started. What if I put my local editor on the web? What if they could just get the code from the project, put it in an online editor, and send the link to me so I can look at it with running code? So that idea stayed in my head for a long while. And yeah, I started going to university, started going to do parties and such, and at some point I started to get lectures, specifically Java lectures. And that's when I started to play with the idea, and fast forward to April, it was implemented and released, and from there it grew quite a bit. So that's Code Sandbox. I also want to give a small demo. This is Code Sandbox. It looks very much like your local editor, and the only thing here is the preview, and you can change code, and it will open. It will change the preview, at least. Yeah, it does. The cool thing is, it works like your local editor, so you can open multiple files, you can install NPM dependencies, and if you save, we fork the sandbox, and you get a very cool name, Hopeful, I can't read it, Hopeful Grader. That was released a week ago, those fancy names. And you can share this URL with someone else, and they can then check the code as well. So it's a good way of sharing. We also had some values. our goal with Code Sandbox is to lower the learning curve. We want to make it easy for people to get started if they want to learn development. We want to encourage sharing and discovery, and we want to give a local editor experience. So that was the recap. Also, during the last presentation, I gave some statistics on how much usage we have, and now we're going into the future. So we had this at statistics last year, and now we have this. So it's grown quite a bit. We now have more than twice more monthly visitors, more than 5 times sandboxes, and more than 6 times files on Code Sandbox. And it's really cool. It keeps getting used. That's really nice. And also, 2 weeks ago, we announced that we had a seed round for Code Sandbox, so that we now have funding. It now operates as a real company. And on product-wise, we also changed quite a bit, because this was the editor a year ago, and this is the editor now. It seems like we got much more goth. We got very dark. So this talk will be what actually happened in between. What happened between last year and this year, and it will be very much like a story, but it will be like 30% story and 70% technical details. So right after I did my talk at React Europe, I started to do an internship at Facebook, because I wanted to learn how it was to work for a very big company, and I thought I would learn a lot from the people working there. And that turned out to be true. I learned a lot there, although it was also pretty hard, because I was already working full-time on Code Sandbox, and now I also had the full-time internship. So I realized that every day I had to pick 2 of these 3. I had internship, Code Sandbox, or social activities with the other interns. And I had to pick 2, and it wasn't possible to not pick the internship. That would be very bad. So normally I would have like 3 or 4 hours a day to work on Code Sandbox in the evening after the internship. And that was pretty hard, because if I didn't do that, work would pile up with, like, it's an open source library, so open source issues, pull requests, also support emails, people asking questions. But I also realized that if I realize that I don't have a lot of time, I actually use that time super efficiently. I make sure that I only do the most important work in that time, and during the day I would already plan out what I'm going to do in those 3 hours. So for me, personally, time constraint improves efficiency. I also noticed this when studying. During the lectures I would think, okay, when I'm done with the lecture, I will do this, this, and this, and then I would work on it, because I didn't have much time. I had to go to another lecture later on. So you can see me here in the Pret-a-Manger. Pret-a-Manger was my favorite place of England. You British people should not judge me. I was testing Code Sandbox live, which is like live editing, and what's a better place to test it than literally in a coffee shop with flaky network connections. So real world conditions. During the internship, we released something called Code Sandbox Themes, and we got that idea because we were following a workshop by Sarah Drasner, and she was using a theme called Night Owl. And Sarah Vieira and I went on to try to implement this theme inside Code Sandbox, and I want to show you how it actually works. So the implementation is actually quite simple, and that's really cool. On the left side, you can see this code. It's a JSON file, and it's the theme of VS Code. And the nice thing is that it's a JSON file. So the top part of the JSON file is like an explanation. It has, as key, it has the element, and as value, it has the color. So it says like, oh, for the button, the background should be blue. For the hover, should be this other blue. Then at the bottom, it would give syntax highlighting. Now the nice thing is that we already had implemented, we were using styled components for our whole editor. So we already had context with themes. So we just put this whole JSON file parsed on our context, and suddenly we got theming inside Code Sandbox. You can also, maybe I can show it. Oh, I should have done this earlier. If I change this, you can see the editor updating, and the cool thing is that the components just respond to a change in their context. And the result of that, okay, now it might get, whoa. And as a result, those components update. I really like this part of React. The harder part was syntax highlighting. So who knows this icon? Who recognizes this icon? Whoa, a few people. Oi, oi, oi. So this icon is from TextMate, a prehistoric code editor. And it was super popular. It was really popular. And TextMate introduced the concept of TM language. TM language is a file that describes how to convert a blob of code into tokens. So it would say if you have let A is 5, it would say let is a keyword, 5 is a numeric. And syntax highlighting teams use this information to say like numerics are this color, keywords are this color. They used it, the TM language file described it using reg expressions. So you would have typescript.tm language, and then you would be able to syntax highlight TypeScript. The tricky thing is, TM language used something named Oniguruma. And Oniguruma is a C library for reg expressions, and it used some very specific features for this. So porting this to the browser and making it work in CodeSandbox turned out to be very hard. Some people tried to convert the C code to JavaScript code, literally, and it turned out to be tens of times slower than the original C implementation. So for a long time, it wasn't possible to have local syntax highlighting working in the browser, because every other editor was using TM language for syntax highlighting, including VS Code. But now we live in the future, and we got WebAssembly. So Nick Sandu, he made a version of Oniguruma in WebAssembly, and this is super cool because we got similar performance by running the WebAssembly version in the browser, and we were able to syntax highlight now the existing TM language files in the browser, and that was super cool. This is like a very good example of how WebAssembly can improve web applications. This is just one example. It's also super interesting what Figma, for example, is doing with writing their rendering engine partly in Rust and WebAssembly to improve performance. There are so many use cases for WebAssembly, and I think if you know Rust, that's a really good skill to have, especially in the future. When we released this, the people were very enthusiastic. It was very nice. But there was also this tweet. It didn't say what about extensions, but they said it would be very cool if we would also have VS Code extensions. And when you think of themes, extensions are not that far off, but no one knew that our implementation was literally parsing a JSON file and putting it on the context. And VS Code extensions, that was a whole different beast. But it was still something interesting to explore, because if we support VS Code extensions, it would really, we would get a whole ecosystem of new extensions working. So I said, challenge accepted. And I started looking into how VS Code extensions work. So who of you run VS Code right now as their primary editor? Wow, oi, oi, oi. I hope someone from Microsoft is watching, because it's a lot. So to me, VS Code feels very snappy. And that's because they have a very interesting way of running extensions. They run the extensions in a separate node process called the extension host. And the extension host is responsible for giving the API to the extensions to run, and then connecting with the VS Code itself to actually run the relevant commands. The very good thing about this is, one, if an extension goes rogue or hangs, then the UI of VS Code doesn't hang. You'll just won't get autocompletions anymore. Second reason is, if the extension host is using a lot of memory, VS Code can just try to restart the extension host and everything will work as expected. The user won't notice anything. The third reason is, extensions don't have direct access to the UI, and this is very controversial but powerful. VS Code, they can only access parts of VS Code, like they can create a tree view, for example. And the good thing about this is that it's good for performance. VS Code can make sure that everything is accessible that extensions make, because they use this API for it. And they can also optimize for it. For example, they use windowing. And there are many more good advantages of using extension host, like you can run it on another server even if you wanted to. But yeah, that's what made VS Code primarily very fast, I think. Extension hosts, so extensions, they can spawn other node processes. For example, the TypeScript extension would start TS server, which will do all diagnostics on TypeScript files. So how to implement this in CodeSandbox? Well, CodeSandbox wasn't running VS Code at all. We were running Monaco, and Monaco is like an extracted version of VS Code in a, it's like a simple version of VS Code extracted to make work in the browser. So it had some of the VS Code APIs, but many of them were renamed or didn't exist. So the initial idea I had was take the extension host, put a bridge between it, which will receive the messages, and then convert it to a CodeSandbox API. So convert all the API calls to make it work in CodeSandbox. Well, I had 3-4 hours a day to work on this, and it turned out to be a lot of work. I think it's a very clean approach, and that's something that's really useful. But I didn't have enough time to implement it this way. So I didn't try this. My second approach was a bit more crazy, and that was literally running VS Code inside CodeSandbox. So VS Code would be responsible for contacting the extension host and running all the APIs. And this is an interesting approach, and it turned out that it worked. The initial try I did was, so this is how VS Code runs. VS Code is an Electron application, and Electron allows you to run web applications on your local machine, because Electron provides you with all native modules like FS for file system, net, TTY, module, HTTP, and it gives you some extra APIs so that you can, for example, change the touch bar if you wanted to. In Electron, you have a main process, and a main process can spawn render processes. And these render processes, they are responsible for rendering the window. My initial idea was very, very naive. I thought, well, let's just stop all the modules. Stop Electron, stop FS, stop module. And it would have been very cool if that would work, because then you would literally be able to run any Electron application in the browser, like we would also be able to run Atom. But again, this was also a lot of work. So next try was looking actually at the code of VS Code, and it turns out that it's very well architectured. VS Code uses services for logic. For example, they have the file service, or they have the editor service, and the file service is responsible for reading and writing files. Editor service is responsible for rendering or handling all the logic of the editor. And these services get injected in each other. So the editor service can request a file service, and it would be dependency injected into the editor service, so they can use that. And the cool thing is they allow you to override services. So I created a CodeSandbox service, which was responsible for communicating with the CodeSandbox APIs. And then I just started creating lots of services. Every service that had native modules in them was replaced with my own version of the service. So file service, storage service, they were using native modules. So instead of, I created a file service that not used FS, it used the CodeSandbox API to retrieve and save files. And that turned out to work quite well. I think I can give us a demo. So this is already running VS Code in the browser, and there is no server involved. Maybe I can make it a bit bigger. So you get everything from like all this, well, the familiar command palette, but you also get things like the file switcher. You get things like settings of VS Code. Now this is very cool, because do I have VS Code open? I don't. Code. Because now you would be able to get your existing settings. Wow, I have it already open from my last practice session. And you can just copy it, and you can save it in here. And suddenly, your CodeSandbox editor works like your VS Code editor. And the same works for like key bindings. If I want to change the key bindings, you can change that as well and add your own key bindings to it. So that's a very powerful concept, because it is very good with the value of local editor experience. There were some requirements with this implementation. I didn't want to change code, because every change that I make is a future merge conflict if we wanted to update with VS Code, so we only added code. We exposed VS Code as an API, so that most logic of handling with VS Code would be in CodeSandbox itself, so contributors won't have to learn a new code base to add new functionality. And it should be fast and small, because we're not an Electron application, we're a web application. So lots of people will download this. So we do a lot of tree shaking and minification on the VS Code bundle. But then you get the advantages, and that's really cool. For example, if VS Code releases a new monthly update, 2 days later we can also release the same patch notes, but then for CodeSandbox. That's a really cool thing. We're not reinventing the wheel. I even found some new VS Code features when implementing VS Code in CodeSandbox, and now I use them a lot. And you stay familiar with the existing editor. You can have the same key binding, same settings as your local editor, but then also online if you're switching between them often. So this is the actual implementation. Back to the story. So the internship ended, and I now had to make a choice. Am I going to work full-time on Facebook, or am I going to work full-time on CodeSandbox? Facebook was very attractive because the people there were super nice, super smart, and I thought I hadn't learned enough yet at Facebook. I also really enjoyed the work I did there. I worked on JavaScript Foundation team on writing bundlers. But I was also, CodeSandbox was growing, and I also really enjoyed working on CodeSandbox. And in the end, if I would go full-time with Facebook, then I would probably still work those 3 or 4 hours every day on CodeSandbox as well, and I think that would not be a sustainable workday. So I decided in the end to go with CodeSandbox, and together with my friend and co-founder, Bas, we decided to make CodeSandbox a real company. We wanted to grow the team and allow more people to work on it. So we got an investment of about $2.4 million from these investors, and some of these are really cool, well, everyone is really cool. I mean, they are all, yeah, it's, some of them are really old advisors, like they've advised me since long ago, like Marco Janssen, and some of them are really in the separate, like in a very similar field, like Dylan, he has Figma, which is an in-browser design tool. So I'm super happy with people working. And the team has grown as well. We now have 6 people instead of 2. So actually, I should be doing my stand-up right now, but I'm giving a talk, so I'm not here at the stand-up. We have Ives, that's me, Bogdan, Sarah, Bas, Oscar, and Drake all working on CodeSandbox, and it's only, we're growing the team to like 12 people next year, so this year. So that's also really cool. Another thing that I noticed is that as more people started working on CodeSandbox, I didn't have time to work on code. I used this graph last year as well, but instead of me working on code, it was me getting good grades. As CodeSandbox got more popular. So that's something that I still am exploring right now. It's suddenly I don't work on product that much anymore, but I start writing specs and I start writing documents instead of code. And that's a complete switch of what I was doing. Now I'm instead, I'm not working on code that much, and I'm still figuring out how that's all, what I can learn from it. So that's a to be continued. I want to give a talk about that later. So this is, in a nutshell, what CodeSandbox has done the last year. Thanks a lot for listening and seeing the talk. And this is my cat, well, our cat, sitting on my keyboard and preventing me from doing any work in a very majestic way. I think he also broke my keyboard because now I have those double characters on my MacBook keyboard as well. If you want to help with the project, it's open source on CodeSandbox/CodeSandbox client, and well, my name is Ives, and my Twitter is ComputeIves. Thanks a lot for listening.